Imagine a child. He is 6 years old. He has his father's eyes. He laughs easily, with big, full belly laughs that fill a room. The servants adore him. His governess calls him her ray of sunshine. His grandmother keeps a garden just for him, because he loves flowers, and she loves him, and that is what grandmothers do. His name is John. His father is the King of England. Now imagine the morning everything changed. John is on the floor. He doesn't know how he got there. His body did something without asking his permission, something terrible and frightening, completely beyond his control. The people around him are trying to keep their faces calm. They are not succeeding. His governess grips his hand so tightly it almost hurts. He doesn't know the word for what just happened. He is 6 years old. He also doesn't know that the conversation is already taking place. Somewhere down the hall, behind a closed door, in the low, careful, deliberate voice adults use when they have already made a decision. Not about how to help him. Not about how to explain to him what is happening inside his own body. But what to do with him. How to manage him. How to contain him. How to ensure he never becomes, the word they will not say aloud, not yet, a problem. He is 6 years old, on the floor, holding his governess's hand. He doesn't know the door is already closing. He doesn't know it will never open again. Royal children like him were born inside the most powerful palaces on earth. They wore silk. They were carried by servants. And then they simply vanished. The history books are full of kings who ruled with an iron fist, queens who outwitted entire governments, and princes who fought in wars before they turned 20. But within those same gilded halls there existed another story, quieter, darker, and almost completely erased. The story of children born wrong by royal standards. Children whose existence threatened crowns, embarrassed dynasties, and destroyed the image of divine perfection upon which monarchy depended for its survival. For centuries, royal families across Europe worked tirelessly to project one thing above all else: the appearance of God's favor. Wealth was proof of it. Military victories were proof of it. And healthy, capable heirs, the kind who could grow up, take the throne, and continue the bloodline, were the ultimate proof. A child born with Down syndrome, with its visible features and cognitive differences, was the precise opposite of that proof. It was a crack in the marble, and cracks in palaces were plastered over as quickly as possible. What happened to those children, and the remarkable, tragic, and occasionally redemptive stories of those we actually know, is one of the most overlooked chapters in royal history. Before we can understand what happened to these children, we need to understand how the world saw them. Down syndrome was not identified as a medical condition until 1866, when British physician John Langdon Down formally described the pattern of characteristics he observed in a group of patients. He gave the syndrome its name, though the term he chose, Mongolism, was rooted in the racial pseudoscience of his era and has since been completely discarded. But for our purposes, the crucial fact is this: before 1866, no one had a framework for understanding what Down syndrome was. And before 1959, when French geneticist Guillaume Lejeune discovered that the condition results from a third copy of chromosome 21, a random genetic event called trisomy 21, no one understood what caused it. That matters enormously, because for virtually the entire arc of royal history, a child born with Down syndrome was not understood as someone with a chromosomal variation. They were understood through whatever interpretive lens the era offered, and history's lenses were rarely kind. In medieval Europe, unusual births were frequently interpreted as divine punishment: a mother who had sinned, a king whose bloodline was cursed, a union that had offended God. In some regions and periods, children born with visible differences were considered changelings. Fairy children swapped for the real baby, and treated accordingly, often with terrifying results. Even in the more enlightened courts of the 17th and 18th centuries, a child who could not speak clearly, could not receive a formal education, could not fulfill the expected functions of a noble person, was at best an object of pity and at worst a political catastrophe. And so the question facing royal parents throughout history, whenever such a child was born, was not how do we help this child thrive? It was how do we make this disappear? To fully understand what royal families did with their disabled children, one must understand what they stood to lose. Monarchies did not derive their power from armies or treasuries alone, though they needed both. They derived it from legitimacy, from the idea, propagated across centuries, that God had chosen that particular family to rule, that their blood was different, superior, blessed. The hereditary principle, the notion that a crown should pass automatically from parent to child, was the very foundation on which these dynasties rested. Every element of royal life was designed to reinforce that idea. The portraits, the ceremonies, the carefully staged public appearances, the mythology of royal lineage stretching back to heroes and saints. A child with Down syndrome did not merely complicate that image. He threatened to unravel it entirely. If the king's blood was divinely chosen, why did God give him a son who could not speak? Why did the queen's womb, supposedly blessed by heaven, produce something the court could not explain? These were not abstract theological questions. They were weapons that political enemies would use without hesitation. And so the machinery of concealment was set in motion. It operated in silence, efficiently, and with the full cooperation of the people most trusted to keep royal secrets: physicians, midwives, ladies-in-waiting, household staff. The tools of erasure were remarkably consistent across centuries and borders. First, the false death. A child could simply be declared stillborn or dead in the days following birth, even if very much alive. A body was presented, sometimes real, sometimes not. Appropriate mourning was performed, and the child was quietly handed off to someone far from court. There were no birth registration systems, no photographers waiting outside palace gates, no independent verification of any kind. The royal family's word was law, including on who had been born and who had died. Second, rural removal. A child who survived long enough to make a false death implausible could be sent to the country for their health. This was a completely accepted concept in aristocratic Europe. Country air was considered restorative. A child convalescing from some vague illness on a distant estate, cared for by a local family or a handful of loyal servants, attracted no particular attention. Years could pass. Decades. The child grew up out of sight, out of mind, and out of history. Third, the monastery. The church offered a remarkably convenient solution for royal families in Catholic Europe. Sending a child, particularly a daughter, to a convent or monastery was entirely normal and carried no stigma. It could even be framed as piety, devotion, and honor. Behind convent walls, no questions were asked, no portraits were painted, and no heirs were expected. These methods were not chosen at random. They were chosen because they left no trace, and without a trace, history could not follow. No royal family in European history more vividly illustrates the catastrophic consequences of placing blood purity above all else than the Habsburgs. Their story is so extreme, so well documented, and so biologically fascinating that it almost reads like dark satire, except that real royal children suffered and died because of it. The Habsburgs ruled the Holy Roman Empire and later the most powerful empire in continental Europe for centuries, with a family motto that summarized their strategy with almost comic frankness: let others wage war, thou, happy Austria, marry. Marriage was their weapon. By marrying exclusively within their own family, uncles to nieces, first cousins to first cousins, generation after generation. They believed they were concentrating power and keeping wealth within the dynasty. What they were actually doing was concentrating genetic catastrophe. Modern scientists have calculated the inbreeding coefficients of the Spanish Habsburg kings, a measure of how closely related parents were to one another, and the figures are staggering. Only half of all Habsburg children survive to age 10, compared to an 80% survival rate among ordinary people of the same era. Their genetic line deteriorated progressively until Charles II, the last male heir, who was so physically and mentally disabled that he could barely produce children, ending Habsburg rule in Spain. Charles II, who died in 1700, is the most extreme documented case of what royal inbreeding could produce. He was so severely disabled, physically and mentally, that he could barely walk or speak until age 10, and struggled throughout his life with speech and eating due to his jaw deformity. His genome was comparable to that of a child born of a brother and sister. Contemporary chronicles describe a man who could not chew properly, who drooled, who suffered convulsions, and whom diplomats described as barely able to follow what was happening around him. But Charles II, for all his suffering, was at least the king. He had a name, he had portraits, he had chroniclers. What historians suspect, and cannot entirely prove, is how many Habsburg children before him simply ceased to exist in the records, not because they died, but because they were made to disappear. With an infant mortality rate already devastated by inbreeding, the Habsburgs had both the motive and the machinery to ensure that children who survived but were visibly different were quietly removed from the historical narrative. One of the most heartbreaking and well-documented cases of royal concealment, though not strictly related to Down syndrome, illustrates precisely how even 20th-century monarchies handled children who complicated the image. Prince John Charles Francis of the United Kingdom was born on July 12, 1905, the youngest of 6 children of King George V and Queen Mary. He was 6th in line to the throne at birth and grew up at Sandringham with his siblings. In his early years, John appeared healthy, energetic, and charming. He was known within the family as Johnny. He had bright eyes and a seemingly easy temperament. Then, at 4 years old, everything changed. He suffered his first epileptic seizure, and his condition gradually worsened. Historians also believe John showed signs of what we would today recognize as autism, delayed language development, difficulties with social interaction, behavioral patterns that set him apart from his siblings. Members of the royal family decided to conceal John's condition from the public entirely. For years, John was cared for within the family's Sandringham estate. He attended no school. He appeared at no public events. His siblings visited him, until his seizures became too distressing to witness. His grandmother, Queen Alexandra, maintained a garden at Sandringham specifically for him, which became his greatest pleasure. His mother, Queen Mary, visited frequently. These people were not monsters. They were people trapped within a system that had no language, no tools, and no tolerance for the kind of difference John represented. In 1917, doctors advised that John be separated from his siblings because his condition had worsened significantly. He was sent to live at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, cared for primarily by his governess, Charlotte Bill, known affectionately as Lala. To provide him with company, Queen Mary arranged for local children to visit him, and John formed a close bond with the niece of a Sandringham stable hand. By all accounts, within his small contained world, John was happy. But he was invisible, never formally acknowledged. He simply did not exist in the royal family's public record. On January 18, 1919, following a severe seizure, John died in his sleep at Wood Farm. He was 13 years old. His epilepsy was revealed to the public only after his death. Queen Mary wrote in her diary that his death was a great shock, although for the poor little troubled soul, death came as a great release. She wrote to a friend that his illness was becoming worse as he grew older, and so he is out of it all. The language is striking. Not grief, exactly. Relief. Acceptance of erasure as mercy. This was not cruelty in the ordinary sense. Queen Mary appears to have genuinely loved her son, but it reveals the degree to which the royal mind had internalized the idea that difference was tragedy, and that removal from public life, from history, from memory, was not a punishment, but a kindness. John was buried at Sandringham, in a small and quiet funeral. The Daily Mirror reported his death on January 20, marking the first public mention of his epilepsy. For decades he was known as the Lost Prince. A 2003 British television drama by that name brought his story back to public attention, winning an Emmy Award. But for most of the century following his death, he simply vanished. If the story of Prince John suggests that royal concealment was a relic of Victorian sensibility, the story of Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon proves that it was practiced, deliberately, systematically, and with supporting documentation well into the 20th century. Nerissa Jane Irene Bowes-Lyon was born on February 18, 1919. Her sister Catherine Juliet followed on July 4, 1926. They were the intellectually disabled daughters of John Herbert Bowes-Lyon and his wife Fenella. Their father John was the brother of Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the woman who would become the Queen Mother. That made Nerissa and Catherine first cousins of Queen Elizabeth II herself. Both sisters were born with severe developmental disabilities. In the medical terminology of the time, they were labeled imbeciles, a term today considered deeply offensive, used to describe people with significant cognitive impairments. Neither ever learned to speak. In 1941, when Nerissa was 22 and Catherine 15, the decision was made to institutionalize them at the Royal Earlswood Hospital, a facility in Redhill, Surrey, that cared for people with learning disabilities. They were not alone. 3 of their cousins, Idonaea, Rosemary, and Etheldreda Fane, were admitted to the same institution on the same day. 5 family members, hidden together, in a single act of aristocratic erasure. And then the family did something even more extraordinary than hiding them. They declared them dead. The 1963 edition of Burke's Peerage, the authoritative genealogical register of the British aristocracy, falsely listed both women as deceased. Nerissa had supposedly died in 1940, Catherine in 1961. Both were very much alive, living in an institution, receiving no visits from the royal family. According to a 2011 television documentary about the sisters, throughout their time in the hospital there is no known record of any member of the Bowes-Lyon or royal family ever visiting them, despite the fact that their aunt, the Queen Mother, was patron of MenCap, a charity specifically dedicated to supporting people with learning disabilities. The Queen Mother publicly championed the cause of disabled people, while her own nieces lay forgotten in an institution 30 miles from London. The revelation of Nerissa and Catherine's existence, which came in a 1987 report in The Sun, gave rise to widespread speculation that the royal family had deliberately concealed them due to the stigma associated with disabilities. Family members denied this, with Lord Clinton publicly suggesting that the incorrect information in Burke's Peerage had simply been an error, that his mother Fenella was a scatty person who had filled in the form incorrectly. The argument is difficult to believe. One might carelessly misrecord a single relative, but recording 2 as dead, in different years, in Britain's most authoritative genealogical publication, and then having no known contact with either of them for decades, while an aunt publicly promoted the rights of disabled people, was not carelessness. It was a decision. When Nerissa died in 1986, No family member attended the funeral. She was buried in Redstone Cemetery, Earlswood, with a plastic tag and a serial number on her grave, until her existence became public and the family added a proper headstone. Catherine survived until 2014. She lived to see a world in which Down syndrome was understood, in which people with intellectual disabilities appeared on television, in schools, and in workplaces. Whether any of that world reached her, in the care facilities she passed through after Earlswood closed in 1997, is not recorded. The story was later portrayed in the 4th season of Netflix's The Crown, in an episode titled The Hereditary Principle. In it, the Queen Mother delivers a devastating line: "The hereditary principle is already hanging by such a slender thread. Add mental illness, and it's gone. The gene pool of that family had better be 100% pure." Whether those were her actual words, no one can know. But they capture, with chilling precision, the logic that governed these women's treatment. The private concealment practiced by royal families for centuries became, under the Nazi regime, state law and then state murder. The Nazis were obsessed with what they called racial hygiene. The disabled, the mentally ill, the unfit. They were not merely people to be hidden. They were threats to the purity of the German race, and they were to be eliminated. What began as forced sterilization became, within a few years, mass murder. From August 1939, the Interior Ministry registered children with disabilities, requiring doctors and midwives to report all cases of newborns with serious disabilities. Those to be eliminated were identified as all children under 3 years of age in whom serious hereditary diseases were suspected, explicitly including Down syndrome, microcephaly, hydrocephalus, and paralysis. From October 1939, public health authorities began encouraging parents of disabled children to admit their young children to specially designated pediatric clinics across Germany and Austria. In reality, the clinics were extermination wards for children. Parents were told their children were being sent for enhanced care. In due course, they received letters informing them that the child had died of pneumonia, that the body had been cremated to prevent the spread of disease. Falsified death certificates, condolence letters from doctors who had themselves administered the lethal injections. This program, eventually known as Aktion T4, named for its administrative headquarters at Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, was expanded to include adults. Although it officially ran only from 1939 to 1941, the euthanasia policy continued in secret throughout the Second World War, resulting in the deaths of between 200,000 and 350,000 people. The gas chambers and bureaucratic machinery developed to kill disabled people were subsequently adapted for use in the extermination of the Jewish people during the Holocaust. The final solution was not born fully formed. It was first practiced on disabled children. It is here that the story of Princess Alexandrine of Prussia ceases to be merely moving and becomes truly extraordinary. Alexandrine Irene of Prussia was born on April 7, 1915, at the Kronprinzenpalais in Berlin, the fifth child and first daughter of Crown Prince Wilhelm of Prussia and Crown Princess Cecily. Shortly after her birth, it became clear that Alexandrine had Down syndrome. Yet rather than stigmatizing her, her family embraced her fully and did not shut her away out of fear of reputational damage, despite their royal status. This was extraordinary. At a time when royal children with Down syndrome were systematically removed from records, the Hohenzollerns, the German imperial dynasty, grandchildren of Kaiser Wilhelm II himself, kept their daughter visible. They called her Adini. She appeared in official family photographs and at events. She was cared for primarily by her nurse, Selma Bosi. Her mother, Crown Princess Cecily, mentioned her prominently in her 1931 memoirs, Memoirs of the Crown Princess Cecily, describing her and her sister as the sunshine of our house. Throughout history, it was common for royal children with disabilities or additional needs to be hidden entirely from the public. Princess Alexandrine, however, was not treated this way, and was as full a member of the family as any of her siblings. Between 1932 and 1934, she attended the Tripur Special School in Jena, the first European educational institution dedicated to the academic and artistic education of children with physical and psychological disabilities. And then the Nazis came. By the time Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, and Action T4 began systematically murdering disabled people in 1939, Alexandrine was an adult woman living in Bavaria. Historians believe that her prior visibility, combined with being an integrated and deeply loved member of a prominent family that had the means to care for her privately rather than institutionalizing her, saved her life. The Nazi extermination program targeted primarily those who were already institutionalized. Their families were often deceived into surrendering them, or simply informed after the fact. Alexandrine was not institutionalized or abandoned. She was at home. She was known. And her family had the status and resources to keep her there. She lived to age 65, an unusually long life expectancy for someone with Down syndrome in the early 20th century, when the average life expectancy for people with the condition was around 10 years. Her case highlighted the emerging possibilities of supportive care. She spent most of her adult life near Lake Starnberg in Bavaria, assisted by a nurse named Erika Strecker, and was regularly visited by her family, especially her brother Louis Ferdinand. Alexandrine died on October 2, 1980, at the age of 65 in Starnberg, Bavaria. A private family ceremony marked her funeral, after which she was buried in the crypt of Hohenzollern Castle in Baden-Württemberg, alongside her parents and several of her siblings. She was buried with the dignity befitting a princess, because she had always been treated as one. Historian Robert Bogdan, who wrote a photographic essay on Alexandrine, noted that he had never encountered such a contrast. An exalted title like princess linked to what was ordinarily the stigmatizing condition of Down syndrome. That dissonance tells us everything about the era in which she lived, and how truly extraordinary her family's choice to love her openly really was. It would be easy, and wrong, to reduce the history of royal children with Down syndrome to simple cruelty. The picture is more complicated, and deserves honest treatment. Many of the parents who sent their children away, or allowed them to be erased from the records, did so in a context of profound medical ignorance. Before Lejeune's discovery in 1959, there was no understanding that Down syndrome was a random chromosomal event, that it could happen to anyone, to any family, regardless of the parent's health, behavior, or moral standing. Without that knowledge, having a child with visible cognitive differences meant something different from what it means today. It invited suspicion. It carried a stigma that attached not only to the child, but to the parents, and to the entire bloodline. For a dynasty whose survival depended on the perception of divine favor and genetic strength, that stigma was not merely embarrassing. It was existential. None of this justifies what was done. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon were not hidden in 1941 because their family lacked access to modern genetics. They were hidden because acknowledging their existence was inconvenient. The Queen Mother was patron of a charity for people with learning disabilities, while her own nieces were listed as dead in the pages of Burke's peerage. That is not ignorance. It is a choice. And the Nazi Action T4 program did not operate in the shadows of medieval confusion. It operated in a modern state, organized by credentialed physicians, bureaucratized with documentation, and implemented with technical precision. The 200,000 to 350,000 people murdered under that program did not die because their killers lacked knowledge. They died because their killers held an ideology that declared certain lives unworthy of being lived, and had the institutional power to act on it. What we know with certainty is that in the great royal and imperial houses of Europe, the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns, the British Windsors and their related aristocratic families, the Bourbons, the Romanovs, children with Down syndrome were born. Statistically and inevitably, they were born. The condition occurs in approximately 1 in every 700 births. Royal families were not exempt from biology, however much they believed themselves to be. And what the record shows is that almost none of those children appear in it. Royal family portraits across the centuries are filled with healthy, composed, formally dressed children who grew up to make political marriages and continue dynasties. The children who did not fit that model are overwhelmingly absent, not because they were not born, but because their existence was managed and removed from history. The gaps in the record are themselves evidence. Too many died in infancy at convenient moments. Too many were sent to the country never to return. Too many appear briefly in an account book and then vanish. Historians who study disability and royal history have observed patterns of suspicious absence that align too perfectly with what we know about the treatment of disabled people in these eras to be coincidental. What we are left with are the exceptions. The handful of cases in which the cover-up did not hold, in which a journalist got the story, in which a documentarian found the paper trail, in which a television drama brought the forgotten cousins back to the screen for a generation of viewers who had never known they existed. The 20th century transformed the lives of people with Down syndrome, slowly, painfully, and incompletely. Lejeune's discovery in 1959 gave the condition a biological explanation and moved it, at least scientifically, out of the realm of divine punishment or moral failure. Educational systems, advocacy organizations, and shifting cultural attitudes began to build a world in which people with Down syndrome could attend school, hold employment, form relationships, and live in their communities rather than being warehoused in institutions. The average life expectancy for someone with Down syndrome in the early 20th century was around 10 years. Today, with modern medical care, it is over 60. That is not merely a medical achievement. It is the direct result of deciding that these lives deserve investment. But the transformation was not linear, nor universal. Even as late as the 1980s, parents of children born with Down syndrome were routinely advised by physicians to institutionalize them, to place them and move on. The language had changed, no longer imbecile or mongoloid, but the underlying prescription was the same. Hide them, separate them, let the family return to normal. What royal history shows us is not simply that powerful families treated disabled children cruelly. It shows us that the cruelty was systemic, built into the very idea of what these children were supposed to be, and what their families were supposed to represent. Royal families did not invent the stigma of disability. They reflected and amplified it in the societies they governed. When they hid their children, they were doing what virtually every family with sufficient resources did, simply with greater means and higher stakes. The difference, and it is crucial, is that royal decisions shaped culture. When a king declared his disabled child dead and moved on, he reinforced the message to every family in his kingdom that this was how difference was to be handled. The silence of the palaces was not passive. It was instructive. Somewhere in the archives of the great European royal houses, in letters never published, accounts never disclosed, births recorded in private registers that have never been opened to historians, are the names of children whose existence was considered too dangerous to acknowledge. We will probably never know most of them. The machinery of erasure was too thorough, too practiced, too effective. What we do know is enough to sketch the outline of what was lost. Lives that deserved to be lived. Names that deserved to be spoken. Faces that deserved to be painted alongside the kings and queens and princes who did occupy space in history. Nerissa Bowes-Lyon died in 1986 in an institution, with a plastic tag on her grave. Her cousin was the Queen of England. Prince John of the United Kingdom died at 13 years old. Alone with his nanny, his family kept at a distance. He was the youngest son of a king. Princess Alexandrine of Prussia lived to 65, buried with full family honors in Hohenzollern Castle, because her family chose love over image, in a century in which that choice was extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily dangerous. The distance between those three destinies is the distance between what history did to these children and what it might have done, between the world that existed and the world that a different set of decisions might have built. The hereditary principle that royal families protected so desperately was never threatened by the children they hid. It was stained by how they hid them, and the stain has never entirely faded.